We're joined now by author David Maraniss. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who's perhaps best known for his biographies of Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. But his latest book, A Good American Family, tells the story of his father, Elliot Maraniss, and how the Red Scare of the 1940s and 1950s changed his life. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Margaret.
So The Good American Family is actually your American family.
Yes, the title comes from a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee who in 1951 gave a speech and said that he was shocked that anyone from a quote-unquote good American family could be affiliated at any time with the Communist Party. And the whole book is a point of showing that our family was a good American family, even though my father and my mother at one point were members of the U.S. Communist Party.
So both of your parents at one point were members of the Communist Party?
They were students at the University of Michigan in the late 1930s, and they were radicalized there after the Depression, and they had a strong belief in racial justice and economic equality, and they were naive and stubborn about the realities of the Soviet Union and that form of communism.
What did that mean for you growing up? Did you know what communist meant?
Well, of course, I knew what communist meant, but...
In their version of communist.
No, what I knew was what they truly believed in, which
Right.
is what I said, racial
Right.
justice and economic equality. They did not talk about much at all about their past. All I knew is that at one point my father was fired from several jobs until he recovered. And by the time I was politically conscious, my father taught me all of the most important lessons of my career, which were to not trust any rigid ideology, to search for truth wherever I found it, to judge people by who they were and not anything else, and to hate the belief but not the person. And so all of these things really were the foundation of my journalism career and had nothing to do really with the excesses of the earlier communist period.
Well, you write in the book about this idea of un-American. You talk about the hearings before Congress. Yes. What was that like for your father, going through that kind of questioning? Did you ever really sit and talk to him about that?
You know, my dad really didn't want to talk about it by the time I was 2 years old when this happened. And 63 years later, as I was starting to research this book, because before that, you know, I'd written all these biographies of strangers to me, like Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and Vince Lombardi, who became familiar to me by the time I was done. Mm-hmm. This time I was starting with someone who I thought I was intimately familiar with. I was worried, would he be a stranger by the time I was done? Because I didn't really know this part of our family's past. 63 years after he was called before the committee, I was at the National Archives, and I found there the statement that my father wanted to read to the committee at the hearing, and he was not allowed to unless he confessed and named names, which he would not do. And it was while reading that statement, and it was the most sort of prosaic thing, he had typed it on an old typewriter, and the keys stuck, and so the S of statement went up a half a notch. And it was seeing that and thinking about my dad as a hunt and peck typist, you know, the night before that hearing, writing out that statement, that for the first time in my long life, it washed over me about what it must have been like for him at that moment.
And it was in that statement that he never got the chance to read, but had
Yes.
prepared, that he said, "I would rather have my children miss a meal or two now than have them grow up in the gruesome, fear-ridden future for America projected by the members of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. My Americanism has been questioned, and to properly measure a man's Americanism, you must know the whole pattern of a life."
It was a very powerful statement, and it was the statement of an American citizen, of a man who had been the commander of an all-black unit in World War II in the Pacific, being called un-American by a chairman of the committee who had, in his earlier life, been a member of the Ku Klux Klan briefly. And so that juxtaposition of what does it really mean to be an American is as relevant today as it was in the 1950s. You know, I don't write about today in the book, but the echoes are there throughout.
What specifically the echoes? I mean, these days you hear the term socialism thrown about, and it doesn't necessarily have the same resonance, clearly, as during this heated moment in time, but it still has a stigma attached to it.
Well, it has a stigma attached to it by people who want it to have a stigma attached to it. You can talk to people 35 and under, and it's a completely different definition and feeling about socialism. But I would say that the stronger echoes are not about socialism, but about the use of fear as a manipulative tool in the political process, which is what Joseph McCarthy, the senator, used during the 1950s and which the president is using today. Demonizing others, stretching the truth and facts in an effort only for political purposes. And one other thing about that, the comparison between Joe McCarthy and Donald Trump is interesting because I would argue that neither of them were truly ideologues. They were both pushing their agendas solely for their own aggrandizement and almost in a matter of wanting to be public about, to be publicized and use it for publicity.
You level that charge against the president. Do you see the president as really the force for some of these things you're talking about, or is there something more broadly happening in American society?
Well, I think it's more broadly happening in American society, absolutely. I think that the president, Donald Trump, is a reflection of that. And I think that, one of the figures in my book is a congressman from Michigan named Charles Potter, a mainstream, Main Street Republican who fought in World War II, heroically lost both legs fighting in the Colmar pocket, came home as a staunch anti-communist, was on this committee. He's the one who said he was shocked that a good American family could be communist. 10 years after that, after he's elected to the Senate and worked with Joseph McCarthy on that subcommittee, he wrote a book called Days of Shame, regretting all of the excesses of the 1950s. And one can only wonder whether some Republican 10 years from now will write a book called Days of Shame about today, because it's really the Republican Party that is allowing Donald Trump to do all these things. So Donald Trump says he wanted his Roy Cohn as an attorney general. And someone might say, where is the Margaret Chase Smith, the Republican senator from Maine who finally stood up to Joseph McCarthy and was a Republican? Mm-hmm.
Do you, in writing this, did you feel like you were writing a commentary on today? You're drawing these parallels, but this was a different heat of the moment time. The threat felt immediate. There was something to be blamed. And right now what you're talking about is kind of an argument amongst ourselves, isn't it?
In some ways, of course they're different. History doesn't repeat itself. There are echoes of it, but it's not the exact same thing ever. And as a matter of fact, it's upside down now, right? Here you have the president using the term McCarthyism and calling the attacks on him a witch hunt. Right. You have the president cozying up to a communist leader in North Korea and being friendly and doing the bidding of a former head of the KGB. So it's all situational, and of course it's much different. I'm not saying that, but some of the parallels are there, and especially I would say the use of fear and the ability of the government to disrupt and destroy lives.
In writing this, was this sort of therapeutic for you?
That's a great question. I didn't think it would be, but it was. It really helped me understand myself, my family, and my country. All of us hear these stories about our own family. They're part myth and part true, and we never go back and explore them. I had done that with strangers, as I said earlier, but to do it with my own family really helped me understand so much about myself. So in that sense, it was therapeutic.
Did your father, towards the end of his life, have anger about this, or did he feel his worldview evolved or it changed? Did he ever say, I'm no longer, subscribing to this worldview represented by communism, I made a mistake here?
He never said I made a mistake here, but it was obvious. And by the time I was of political consciousness, he was an open-minded newspaper man. Mm-hmm. So he never, he did say at one point that he was stubborn in his ignorance in his earlier life. That's about it. But it was never a matter of repentance, because he evolved, but he never became bitter. Many of the old leftists turned into staunch anti-communist neoconservatives or embittered sort of depressed older people. And my father maintained this optimism throughout. And when I went and studied his earlier writings, you saw this incredible optimism about this country. He never wanted to destroy this country, he just wanted to make it better. And in that process, he both was right about certain huge things and wrong about some.
What made you follow in his footsteps and become a journalist?
I was too stupid to do anything else. All my siblings are scholars and classical pianists, and I followed my dad into to become an ink-stained wretch, you know. But I loved writing from a very early age, and my father certainly didn't discourage that. It's in my blood. My mother was a book editor, my grandfather was a printer, and my dad was a newspaper man, so I followed into that.
And what do you hope people, when they pick up this book, what do you hope that they take away from it?
Well, I wanted to present that era of our history in a vivid way where they would see the human effects of what was happening in an era of fear.
All right. David Maraniss, thank you very much for
Thank
sharing
you,
your
Margaret.
story and that of your family. We'll be right back.